Thank you for joining us tonight as we proudly present our 13th annual Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month event. I'm John Abbott, President and CEO of GBH. At GBH, we endeavor to be inclusive and welcoming to all, embracing the breadth of our entire community. Our commitment to content by and about the AAPI community is evident year-round. And during the month of May, in recognition of AAPI Heritage Month, GBH and GBH World put an exclamation point on our efforts with many hours of documentaries and programs celebrating AAPI contributions and achievements. You'll see clips from some of these films later in our program tonight. While anti-Asian racism has deep roots in our country's history, it should have no place in our future. In these challenging times with anti-Asian hate on the rise here and nationwide, we must all speak out. As leaders in public media, we oppose hatred and racism in all of its forms. Tonight's event includes a forum to examine the history of AAPI hate crimes in the U.S. and to inform viewers how they can become allies and advocates in support of our AAPI community. Tonight's event would not have been possible without the tremendous support we've received from friends in our community. I want to acknowledge the numerous members of the GBH Board of Trustees, Board of Advisors, Advisors Council, and Community Advisory Board who were instrumental in planning this wonderful event. We are so grateful for their leadership and generous commitment to GBH and for all they do as ambassadors for our work all year round. To get our evening started, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Liz Chang, General Manager for GBH Television and World Channel. Liz?
Hello, I'm Liz Chang, General Manager of Television for GBH2, GBH44, GBH Kids, and for World Channel. GBH is the nation's leading public media producer, delivering rich content to serve the public interest while empowering people to think more about the world and the lives they'd like to lead. In May alone, GBH's World Channel will feature more than 40 films about Asian American and Pacific Islander struggles and triumphs. 4 films premiering in May speak to the breadth and diversity of this experience. Hamtramck, USA examines America's first Muslim-majority city, which had been built by German immigrants and populated by Polish Catholics. Bangladeshi and Yemeni Muslim immigrants have been welcomed, yet each community is now jockeying for representation in City Hall. Far East, Deep South follows Charles Chu and his family in a fascinating journey to find their roots, from California to Mississippi during the challenging times in the segregated South. And Curtain Up follows the theater club of PS 124 in New York City's Chinatown as delightful children convince their skeptical immigrant parents that acting and singing can be just as rewarding as studying biology and technology. So let's take a look at these films premiering this month on World Channel's America Reframed.
5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
PS 124 Theater Club is an award-winning after-school program based in Chinatown.
Most of our kids are Asians. You know, Asians can perform.
There's something about music and dance that moves the soul. This is about being a part of America.
I like everything about acting. I don't know how to describe it, I just like it.
I don't have a lot of confidence. I don't know why, actually.
It's easier to be scared than happy.
Who's Asian here?
Me, not you!
You! Yeah, because I'm Chinese Asian.
I'm 100% Chinese.
你为什么中国人都不会中文呢?
She sides with China in the Olympics, and I side with the U.S. Yeah. And then she gets so angry.
And you know what my mom told me? Asian people are horrible at acting. Cannot be acting.
This is important. This is your last show here. You have to be proud of this.
Charlotte, that's so good. Be a good girl. That's what this point is, okay? That's not okay, Russell.
That's not holding hands. This is holding hands, right? You guys can do it too. Whose foot was involved with William's head?
I did it. I'm not doing this. I didn't kick in his hand. It's not gonna It's probably like a second or three method realizing that it doesn't get you a lot of money. And then I'll finally realize acting isn't my real thing, but I still won't give up and I'll still do acting. I thought I could really actually maybe become an actor, but you don't know when life throws you curveballs, so you never know.
Streaming now on GBH World Channel.
I used to collect the list of graduates every year because I was really interested in the last names of the graduates, and watched that list of names shift to Bosnians in the early 90s, and then more and more Bangladeshi names and Yemeni names. And I've realized that I am probably the last in the 100-year line of Polish mayors.
Hamtramck, Michigan, has become the first Muslim-majority city in America.
Inshallah, you support me November 7th as well. Inshallah, we unify together as one. And inshallah, we accomplish the unaccomplished prior.
If you like to change, I have some idea to restructure and modify the administration.
If you care about this community and community's honor, come out and vote.
Feeling confident, feeling happy. This is our time to shine.
আমি এই চিঠিটা আমার বাড়িতে কর্মকর্তা হাসান এর নিকট থেকে পেয়েছি। তিনি লিখেছেন যে তিনি বাংলাদেশি, ইয়ামেনি, পোলিশ, আফ্রিকান আমেরিকান এবং আমেরিকানদের সাথে কাজ করেছেন। কিন্তু নির্বাচনের দিন আমরা পোলিশ আমেরিকান, আফ্রিকান আমেরিকান, ইয়ামেনি, অথবা বাংলাদেশি এর কোনো ঠাই না। আমরা সবাই হলাম ট্রামাকান।
People didn't even think about who is being president of the United States, and tonight they want to know who will be the mayor of Hamtramck. 2 square miles.
Coming soon on GBH World Channel.
Growing up, it was always kind of a mystery about my dad and his side of the family. Whenever my brother and I would ask him about my grandfather, he would just say, oh, it's a sad story, it's not a big deal. One day we came across this photo of a gravestone, and that's when my dad finally told us that this is where my grandfather and great-grandfather were buried. But not in China, in Mississippi.
Chinese people in Mississippi? What happened there?
I actually don't know where we're going and where we're going.
Last thing I thought I'd ever find in Mississippi was a Chinese museum.
I guess there was more than just my grandfather and my great-grandfather.
When the Chinese first came to the Delta, they were treated like we were.
Everything was very segregated. I mean, it was black, white. We were just really in the middle.
I had to attend a segregated one-room schoolhouse.
Growing up, I read about segregation, and I thought that it only affected the black community.
I just didn't really think that it would happen to the Chinese too.
What?
Great-grandpa!
Oh my God.
I knew all your family.
It is so important for people to know what happened with the Chinese Exclusion Act and how it affected Chinese Americans throughout the nation, including the South.
Streaming now on GBH World Channel.
Our final clip is from the American Master's profile of the extraordinary life of Amy Tan. In 1989, Amy Tan's first novel, Joy Luck Club, became the longest-running #1 book on the New York Times bestsellers list. Amy was co-producer and co-screenwriter of the wildly successful Joy Luck Club film. 5 more books on the New York Times bestsellers list and many other works of literature have secured Amy Tan's legacy as one of the most successful and beloved American authors. American Master's Amy Tan, Unintended Memoir is an intimate portrait of Amy Tan's life and career. The documentary premiered on GBH2 and GBH World and can be streamed now on the PBS Video app. Here's an excerpt.
The Joy Luck Club went right to #1 on the bestseller list.
The Joy Luck Club was so massive when it came out. I mean, everybody loved it.
It had such a huge impact on paving the way for other writers of color.
My childhood, with its topsy-turvy emotions, has in fact been a reason to write.
Auntie Daisy and Uncle John were 2 of the founding members of the Joy Luck Club. It was hard to wrap my head around all the different aspects of Auntie Daisy's past. What helped is knowing the story of my grandmother being a concubine.
I didn't understand until I was an adult what she meant by sacrifices. We had many, many arguments, but I came home one day and she was raging and she pushed me and her eyes were glazed in a way they were gone. She was not a tiger mom. She was a suicidal mother. I think it was just an urge she would never be able to get rid of.
There you are, puffing away.
It was part of my decision to not be like her at all.
Amy really started writing as a mental health break from all of the business work that she was doing.
I started to ask her about her life. I would listen to everything. She loved the idea she was helping me to write.
Curry chicken potato. Ooh, yum.
Who are the characters in Amy's work? Her family and people who really have gone through hell and somehow have come out of it.
I am not the subject matter of mothers and daughters or in Chinese culture. I am a writer compelled by a subconscious neediness to know, which is a perpetual state of uncertainty and a tether to the past.
Amy Tan sat down recently with our friend, GBH trustee, Dr. Pam Ettinger, president of Bunker Hill Community College. Here's Pam's exclusive conversation with Amy.
Thank you, Amy, for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
So for your first book, I understand that there was a bidding war between 2 publishers. And when it was published, the Joy Luck Club was an instant bestseller. So looking back now, how did that feel?
It was pretty unreal because I didn't even know that my agent was going to New York to sell this. I had only 3 short stories that I'd written and an outline. And when she said she was going to do that, I thought, oh, she must be a fraud because there's no way that she could sell this to a New York publisher.
Yeah, I mean, that was a complicated time in your life, right? You were working with as a corporate technical writer, I think?
I was a business writer. It was, a lot of people think it's technical because the companies are technical, but I wrote things, everything from rah-rah motivational speeches to, training programs, corporate, kind of communications to people. And especially during divestiture of AT&T when they became, 11 operating companies. So yes, tech companies, but I was a business writer.
That's a really full life, right? 90 hours a week doing this other work, being a daughter, doing all of this work. And you were writing fiction sort of at the margins of a busy life.
Yeah, I didn't love what I was doing. You know, the business writing was great in one sense because it was freelance and I had these clients who were very kind to me. But I never had grown up thinking that I had a passion for telecommunications or account management with a big 8 firm or anything like that. And I started writing fiction as a way to give me something more meaningful, that I would be doing this, but without expectation. I did not need to make a living doing this. I could do it for the love of it and for what I was getting out of it, which was a lot of realizations of who I was and how I became this way.
That's a really powerful perspective, I would imagine, looking back. So I read that you had said that you felt compelled by a subconscious neediness to know, not a need to know, but a neediness to know.
Yeah.
I would love to have you help us unpack that a little bit. What does it mean?
Well, neediness is always there. It's perpetual. You're always starving for some kind of answer. But it really started in childhood because everything that happened to me, I would question. I don't remember a time in my life when I didn't question things. I thought it was normal for everybody to question. And perhaps I came from my father a bit, he was a minister and he questioned himself. Am I being good enough? I didn't question myself in quite that way, although I might say, well, who is this God and what does he think of me? And why does he think that? I would ask myself, why am I being treated this way? What did I do? If I intended to be good, but I'm perceived as bad, why is that? Or if somebody called me a racist name and I'm 6 years old and they say I'm a chink or worse. And I think, what makes me different? What is being Chinese? I would look at my leg. Is this a Chinese leg? If I eat too much Chinese food, will I become more Chinese? You know, so those are the early questions that have a lot to do with identity. I can look at those same questions from childhood and ask questions about who I was as a childhood or why we are, you know, we end up believing certain things based on what's told to us. My thing in life was not to believe, to ask the questions and find the answers myself.
So the Joylight Club hits the public and your fame is astronomically increased. How did you cope as a writer to separate that kind of solitary introspection with all of this adoration?
I never dreamed what happened with this bestseller. I think I'm more realistic about who I am than most people. So what I did is I sat down and I wrote some, they were almost like 10 principles of my life. At the top of the list was family. It had to do with what's important. And the writing had to do with knowing the reasons I write, that they were very personal, very private, and that I shouldn't do something simply because it might make me more famous. So for example, film, to not get sucked into something with the idea that the reward would come afterward. Everything had to be worthwhile in the moment that I was doing it. And in a way, it was because I did not trust success. It's something that is given to you. And if you expect it and it doesn't last, you could be destroyed by it. So I think I started off with grounding rules early. And it still was very difficult to me because I didn't want to believe it. And it took me about 7 months before I did think, well, maybe I can write the rest of my life. I remember telling my husband that and saying, you know, I think this isn't going to go away. I might be able to make a living doing this.
Let's talk about why so many people love your books. To me, when I read your books, I said, oh my God, that's my mom, that's my family. So much of it echoed, but I'm wondering if it's really the particular of Asian American culture or if it's the universal of the mother-daughter dynamic.
You know, I have my reasons for writing, and a lot of it is discovering how all of these events in my life, and even the events in my mother's life and my grandmother's life, has led to a transference of many elements, whether it's a way to deal with tragedy or turmoil. My mother, for example, became suicidal as a result of watching her mother kill herself. Fortunately, I didn't take on that quality, but I took on the need to make decisions and choices for myself, because that is the antidote, not to be pummeled by bad things that people foist on you or that naturally occur, but to realize and to take those choices. Now, I think that within my intentions for writing, that yes, it did involve a mother, the only mother I've had, who happens to be Chinese American and an immigrant. And so people identified with that. People had immigrant parents, Chinese or other. And people would identify being a daughter with a mother they didn't always get along with, or a mother whose daughter was not grateful for what they tried to pass on. And all of those emotional situations, emotional conflicts, I believe, are what people identified with and why they found the book relevant and wanted to read it.
Your mom have had a very difficult past in China. Tell us a little bit more about that.
My mother was, she was born in 1916, and her father died when she was quite young, 1919, during the pandemic. And her mother was left a widow with her and a younger son. In those days, they were pretty much at the mercy of whoever would take care of them. That would be my grandmother's brother, who was a cheapskate and also a drug addict later, would steal money from people. So it was, not a good situation for her. And my mother also was very pretty. Now you would think, well, that's an advantage. In a way it was, but she was made to feel she was so beautiful that this was much of the value of who she was. And she ended up marrying, in a sort of arranged marriage, a pilot who turned out to be a very, very bad man, because everybody said, you were an orphan, basically, after her mother killed herself. She lived in the family, this wealthy family, for a long time, never felt she was part of it, and then got married off to this playboy, in essence, a pilot, who was unfaithful from day one, brought his mistresses home. She, had to endure this marriage. She had a son who died in her arms. She fell in love with my father, a very kind man. She endured going to jail. She came to the United States for love, and she now was nobody. She lost her language, her ability to communicate. She became an invisible person, and that, of course, led her to become overwhelmed. Suddenly, she was no longer quite as beautiful. She was looked at as not beautiful also because she was Chinese. Those are some of the complexities of her life, but what it also came across to me as were these warnings. If you fall in love with somebody who treats you mean, you'll want to kill yourself. By the same token, she'd say, be sure you have a good job, be a doctor, because that way, if you get married, and you don't have to get married, but if you get married and he treats you bad, you can leave because you have your own money. So it was that kind of thing that her experiences shaped me, not that I became exactly the person that she is, but the lessons gave me a way to see my life and what were the pieces that I wanted to take. I wanted to be strong. I didn't want to have regrets in my life. And that was a direct result of how my mother raised me.
Do you ever, Amy, feel pressured to be sort of the spokesperson for the Asian American community because of the high position that you have? in the writing world?
There are expectations, and I understand them, that if you are public, that you have the opportunity to speak for a larger number of people, especially in regards to social justice. I'm very careful, however, because there are people who think, what right does she have to represent us? And as we know, the AAPI community is not homogenous. We're many different peoples from many cultures, and we share some things in common. We are linked, but we have to keep that in mind. And I cannot speak for the whole AAPI communities. I can talk about things that have to do with the needs or bringing awareness to the needs. Been working with been part of organizations like the Asian Pacific Fund or Family Service Agency, and they're people who serve populations that need additional help. So I'm aware of why the myth does not really hold up, and I can talk to that, or I can do campaigning for candidates who are AAPI, which I think is incredibly important. I can speak somewhat to racism, but I can't do everything. Also, in terms of time, so I try to be responsible, but I cannot assume I know everything, and I can't speak for everybody. I hope people understand that. I'm not trying to put myself out as some kind of expert.
So the AAPI hate crimes are definitely on the rise, right? Incidents of hate crimes against Asian Americans in the United States have been rising at an alarming rate since the pandemic. And there are recent horrific crimes in our neighborhoods, in our communities, and they've been widely publicized in the media. The killing of the 84-year-old Thai man in San Francisco, and the mass shootings that has happened in Atlanta. Are you afraid when you leave the house?
No, I'm not really afraid physically. I don't fear that as much as what I might say to somebody if they were to direct an insult, a racist insult to me. Should I react? Should I ignore it? And I think you have to judge, because some of your reactions, if you were to counter it, could result in violence. You could be punched. And so I do have to assess that. It's really interesting. I've received a lot of racist insults over the years on my Facebook page. And they're everything you can imagine, from the go back to where you come from. I could say Oakland, or you eat dogs, and I say, well, actually my dogs are, as everybody knows, are the light of my life. But it does no good, to say these things, in part because they're not looking for rationalizations or rational answers. They're going to continue to believe this. I had a whole slew of them just the other day, because I had on Biden's Facebook page, I would say, for certain measures that were really important to me, I'd say, thank you, President Biden, for embracing all cultures, or thank you, President Biden, for looking at how we can stop the insanity with weapons, killing a lot of people. And I would get 5,000 likes, but I would get 500 comments full of vitriol, a lot of them racist comments. I was going to write them down, because we don't do enough in reporting what the hate comments are. We don't have a central clearinghouse. When people say there are 3,500 incidents of hate crimes against Asians, no, that is just a tiny amount of the number of hate crimes that are happening. And I just wish that we had a clearinghouse, so that even if they're just hateful messages that don't accompany violence, you know if you want to know if they're coming from a group of people who could erupt into violence.
Tell me about what it feels like to have a film crew follow you around, documenting your every move.
It is an intrusion of privacy, certainly, and it was one of the reasons I did not want to do a documentary. But Jamie, the director, James Redford, was a friend, and I absolutely trusted him. And when we did interviews, it was like talking to a friend, having intimate conversations about things that were important to both of us. So with those conversations, other people just kind of fell away. There were times when it was intrusive, but you have to keep in mind they kept the crew very, very small. So it was almost easy for them, except for the big camera, to fade away in the distance. Every now and then I wondered how they were going to use this footage, but I never asked to see it. I wanted to give Jamie the freedom to create the documentary he wanted. And I saw it for the first time in its completed form when it was almost finished. I found out later Jamie made that decision, was forced to make that decision because he was in failing health. And he gave that to me. I watched it, answered back immediately. And that was the last thing he read, my email. And he started the process of dying. He died a few days later. So, you know, you think about the inconvenience of team following you around. You think about the intimacy of conversations with two friends. Totally made it worth it for, you know, for me and for him to have that friendship and have it come out in a documentary.
You are such an amazing narrator, an amazing storyteller. What about teaching the next generation? What does that look like?
You know, I've always resisted teaching. I thought being a published writer doesn't mean you have the credentials to teach. But having done the documentary, I started thinking what I've done is, in a way, talk about my life and see how it led up to this point of my becoming a certain kind of writer. And so when Masterclass, an online program, asked if I would do a class on writing, at first, as with the documentary, I said no. And then later I realized, no, I could talk about writing that has to do with emotional memory and imagination. And so that's what I've done. My class is about something I believe is relevant, especially to first-time novelists, first-time short story writers, and that is you do draw from your past oftentimes and your childhood. It's just there, brimming, waiting to get out. And I think that my class has a lot to do with looking at your past, your moments, and how this formulates the voice you have as a writer and how you create stories out of these situations and conflicts.
Well, I admire your humility. I admire your centeredness, and what an amazing journey you've had. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
What a fascinating conversation. Our thanks to Amy and Pam. I'm Liz Chang, back with part 2 of tonight's event, which examines the rise in hate crimes against AAPI and what steps we can take to be an ally and advocate for AAPI family members and friends. Our panel wants to hear from you. Please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. If you see a question you want answered, vote for it by clicking the thumbs up icon at the bottom of your screen. Moderating our panel this evening is John C. Yang, who is the President and Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. John has worked with the White House and the U.S. Senate in securing the nomination and confirmation of more than 20 AAPI federal judges. He served in the Obama administration as Senior Advisor for the Trade and Strategic Initiatives at the U.S. Department of Commerce, where he was Principal Advisor on Asian issues. Joining us on the panel is Suffolk County District Attorney Rachel Rollins. She's the first woman ever elected as District Attorney in Suffolk County and the first woman of color ever elected District Attorney in Massachusetts. She previously worked as a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. And Dr. Catherine Vuki is an assistant professor of clinical psychology and director of the Asian Mental Health Program at William James College. As a licensed psychologist, Dr. Vuki's research and clinical work focuses on immigration and refugees. Suvana Puv is executive director of the Cambodian Mutual Assistance Association and serves on many boards, including the Asian Pacific Islanders Civic Action Network and the Asian Community Fund Advisory Committee of the Boston Foundation. Ryan Dwan-Win is a Harvard College freshman and co-organizer of the recent Stop Asian Hate Boston rally. For this rally, nearly 800 people marched from Chinatown in Boston to the State House to raise awareness about the increase in crimes committed against Asian Americans. Please join me in welcoming our impressive panel to our virtual stage.
Thank you very much, Liz, for that introduction and introducing all of my fellow panelists. And I am honored to serve as the moderator this evening to talk about the rise in anti-Asian hate. Look, these last 17 months for the Asian American community have been very hard, and there has been a lot of pain and suffering. If you look at statistics from an organization called Stop AAPI Hate, there have been over 6,600 incidents of anti-Asian attacks. When combined with statistics provided by my organization, that number jumps to over 7,500. Certainly in Massachusetts, Massachusetts is not isolated from that. We have seen over 200 documented attacks. But to what writer Amy Tan has said, this is just the tip of the iceberg. These are based on self-reports, voluntary reports, and we know that there are just so many more attacks, so many more acts of discrimination happening. So I'm really honored to join in this conversation to talk about these issues, both about what is happening, as well as how people are feeling, as well as how people are responding to the moment. So let's get at it. Let me start with DA Rollins and talk about sort of how all of this is being processed. Obviously, safety is in the minds of Asian Americans. And I'd like to unpack that a little bit. Because, for example, a lot of people talk about this in terms of hate crimes against the Asian American community. But you know that a lot of these incidents that we're talking about aren't necessarily crimes. So I'd like for you to just start by educating the audience on what exactly is a hate crime, but then how do we talk about other acts of racism that are clearly happening against the Asian American community?
Absolutely. So as many of you guys understand, there are civil violations and there are criminal violations. As the district attorney, my sole world is in the criminal world, but we have exceptional in Massachusetts, an exceptional attorney general in Maura Healey, who has the power to not only go after people criminally, but civilly as well. And we have the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is the federal chief law enforcement officer, that also has that ambidextrous ability of going after somebody criminally or civilly. We know that discrimination is, although maybe not a crime, something that deeply impacts people. That's something that we can go and use either the Mass Commission Against Discrimination, or depending on whether or not it is a sort of fundamental right, or housing, education, access to certain things with your civil rights, you can go to the Attorney General or the U.S. Attorney. But when we come down to the crimes, the criminality of this, Massachusetts law defines a hate crime as any criminal offense that is paired with overt actions that are motivated by bigotry and bias. They include, but are not limited to, threatening somebody or attempting or completing an overt act that is motivated, at least in part, by prejudice or bias of, for example, your race, your religion, your ethnic background, your ability or lack of ability, gender identity, sexual orientation. There are other ways that there can be crimes, John, in the sense that if someone tries to deprive you or a targeted victim of their constitutional rights that we talked about before through threats, intimidation, or coercion, or if there is an act intended to interfere with those very rights through harassment or intimidation. So those are sort of some of the ways that we can We can explain them. There are 2 hate crime statutes really quickly. I don't need to make sure everyone is a lawyer in this, but I do want you to understand there's 2 basic statutes. The first one we like to call a civil rights violation. That's chapter 265, section 37. All right. This makes it a crime, as we said, to interfere with the rights of anyone's constitutional rights through our Massachusetts Constitution or the United States Constitution. And the second category of hate crimes is essentially what we talked about before. It's an assault and battery for the purposes of intimidation. And we can get some sort of escalators in there. If people are specifically using, let's say, a firearm when they do this, which we of course hope doesn't happen, but that allows us to get significantly more time, or unfortunately, and we've seen this, or it hasn't been reported in Massachusetts much. We don't know if that means it's not happening, but certainly in San Francisco and New York, when we see serious bodily injury, right? So add to this though, and I hope we talk about this, John, these are overwhelmingly, not all, but AAPI community, but also elders, right? So there are multiple ways that these harms are impacting. You can be covered for any number of protected categories that you might be in. And then just really, really quickly, some of the fines and fees or time that we can do with respect to some of these crimes are up to $10,000 in the most serious of crimes with bodily injury, and up to 10 years for some of them. And then if there is property damage, because remember, cowards will write on your home, right? Or spray paint your car. Luckily, your physical body might not be harmed, but if they are terrorizing you where you live and spray painting things, there are opportunities for us to get an order of restitution for up to 3 times the value of what that property is. The last thing I'll end with is also, and we've seen this in domestic violence situations and others, it's not just yourself. If they are harming, for example, we've seen household animals, other things like that. We need to make sure we are educating people about this in languages of their origin. I don't want people to understand this 68%, 72%. You need to understand it 100%. And we need to have people that are fluent, at least, or native speakers, hopefully, in all of the wonderful languages the AAPI speaks. So we need to be far better at that as members of law enforcement.
Thank you very much, D.A. Rollins. You've brought up a number of important points, but certainly on language. One thing for people to remember is that about 1/3 of the Asian American population nationwide are what's called limited English proficient. So our community that doesn't speak English fluently and need language assistance. In terms of all the protected categories, currently, according to statistics from Stop AAPI Hate, 65% of the attacks, anti-Asian attacks that have been seen over the last 17 months have been directed at women. So in terms of protected categories, absolutely, we've seen these horrific videos against our elderly, and they are disproportionately represented. But women definitely are disproportionately represented too, and making sure that we have the proper responses for all of our different communities. So,
and of course, we saw that in Georgia, right? Where we had 8 people murdered, 7 women, 6 Asian women, of course.
Exactly, right. So let me move to Dr. Volke and talk about sort of the psychological effect that all of this has had on our Asian American community. And we know some of the statistics now, but the statistics just tell a fraction of the story. I'd love for you to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so we know, racism is a public health crisis. Racism is a health issue. And so I'd say that in the last year, again, racism, discrimination against Asian Americans is nothing new. It's been here since the 1800s. However, because of the rise so rapidly in the last year, and then more recently this last March, I think that is what is now coming into the public consciousness. What is happening, that these attacks against our Asian elderly and our youth. So in addition to being the assistant professor at William James, I also am a psychologist in a mental health, community mental health center. And in this last year, I have seen a rise in referrals for our young people, especially for kids in the middle school, where they're coming in with depression, anxiety. And they're saying that they are being teased and bullied because of the coronavirus. They're saying people telling them they're dirty, they eat bats, you're the cause of this. And so what do? Because no one is stepping in to help them or they don't know who to talk to, they've turned to self-harm behavior. How is it that an 8-year-old boy knows to go buy a knife and comes to school and starts cutting himself? Because they had no adult help. We have seen a rise in attacks against, in the public settings that DA Rollins has said. I could tell you another story of a mother and a child going into a park, a 3-year-old child playing in the park by himself, Asian American. And the mother watched as this child was playing by himself. Another child comes up to him, pulls off his mask and punches him. A 3-year-old was punched. And when the mother asked the child, "Why did you hit my son?" the child said, "Because he wasn't wearing a mask." Where do you learn these messages? Where are we teaching our kids? So these are important messages that we need to stop. We need to be able to have these conversations that this is not okay. And so we do see there's a rise in instances of trauma, anxiety, depression, and even in our elderly, the immigrants who've come over, they've been telling us now that with these attacks, they've been re-triggered by war-torn countries. So they come over now, they see, because they come to the US to be safe, and now they don't feel safe anymore. They don't feel wanted anymore. And so we do see more trauma symptoms.
Thank you. Yeah, one of the things I actually appreciate about this conversation that we're having this evening is none of my panelists, I am Chinese American, East Asian American, so to speak, but none of my panelists are. And I think that's important because when people talk about anti-Asian hate, frankly, unfortunately, people tend to gravitate towards thinking about that as a Chinese American issue or an East Asian American issue. And again, if you look at statistics, about 40% of the people being attacked, according to Stop AAPI Hate, are Chinese American. So what that means is over 60% are not Chinese American. And so, Savannah, let me move to you. Can you talk to me about what this anti-Asian environment means to you as a Cambodian American?
Well, first of all, thank you, John, and thank you, District Attorney, and anyone else for welcoming us and myself to be part of this conversation, because Cambodian Americans in this country make up only about 380,000. That's a small number in terms of the Asian American community. And so having the opportunity to be here to represent that voice means a lot to my heart, my soul, and the voices that are not being heard as well. And so in the Cambodian community, Asian hate means that you can walk around your neighborhood and you can be looked at by someone that doesn't like you or for what you are and what you look like. They can say something to you and you can look at them and either you ignore that or you approach them and say, "Hey, what you're doing is not cool." For me, I think growing up in the Cambodian community, we have a slightly different experience than East Asians, to be honest with you. A lot of us were placed in many of us that came as refugees in the 80s were placed in very difficult neighborhoods, whether it's Lowell, Philadelphia, Chicago, Long Beach, California. All of these cities we landed in were surrounded by Brown and Latinx folks, cities that had trouble with gang issues, cities that had trouble with drug issues. And so we landed in an environment where we weren't welcomed with open arms. We were welcomed with fear, hate, and the unknown of who these new people are. And so I grew up with a lot of individuals that were formerly involved in the streets. And, I think with that mentality, many of us from the Khmer community, not all of us, but some of us and many of us do not tolerate this stuff. And so we want to make sure that, we speak up for as much as we can. We want to make sure that we speak up for not just our older members of our community and our women and our children, but also other ethnic groups as well. Because if we see something that's happening to other ethnic groups and we stand up for them, it's going to be natural that they're going to try to protect us as well. And so that's the message that I'm trying to say in terms of being Cambodian and also being Asian, Southeast Asian community member. But also, I also want to share with the audience too that for those that don't know, Cambodians arrived to this country because of the genocide that took place between 75 and 79. And that killed 2.1 million people in the country, which is a quarter of the country at that time. And then when you arrive to a country where it's supposed to be welcoming to you, but you don't really get that, you build this wall up, you build this defense system, this defense mechanism to make sure that you protect yourselves. And so with that being said, I think it's really important that we continue to speak up and that we also bridge our gaps between each other as well. I think I mentioned this before when we had this conversation in practice round, that we as Asian Americans also have to unite as well. And we have to unite together and build our voice, build our power, so that we are not being pushed around and we are not being unheard. So thanks.
Great. Thanks, Savannah. And I think that's a great segue to get Ryan involved in this conversation, because what you're talking about is uniting. What you're talking about, sort of how do we respond to this moment? And I'd really like to get your thoughts. Obviously, you organized a rally to stop Asian hate, and to think about sort of how we show up in this current climate. You know, how was that experience? So how do we expand on that to make sure that this is not just one moment, but something that will outlive just this period of time?
So the rally really began forming just out of love for my family, out of love for my people, and out of love for my community. As a Vietnamese Laotian American whose parents are refugees from the Vietnam War, they came over during the waves of boat people. I've always felt incredibly close and connected to the collective struggles of Asian Americans just trying to forge a life for themselves in this country. And just witnessing the crimes, the onslaught of attacks and incidents against people who looked just like my own people really hurt me and saddened me and frustrated me. And I had no idea how to channel my anger and frustration. After brainstorming for a little while, I came up with a plan to provide a physical space, a physical demonstration where I could see other people who were not just like me, but people from other communities coming together and uniting behind this one cause. Because looking at the cases that came out all alone in my bedroom, it was very difficult. And Dr. Catherine Wilkie probably knows about the mental stress of just being alone and reading all these news articles coming out one after another. But the rally was wildly successful with between 800 and 1,000 people of all colors, backgrounds, ethnicities, stories come together, braving the biting Boston cold to unite behind this one cause. And it honestly made me very hopeful for the future, because it shows that we don't have to be alone in fighting this cause. We can unite with other people who are going through similar struggles. And this definitely has to be a sustained effort. While physical demonstrations are amazing and a great way to see people around you, knowing that you're not alone, it's only a blip in time, and it has to be sustained with efforts, whether that be through social media, fundraising for local Asian organizations. So I guess just to backtrack, I really had 3 goals for the rally. The first one was to show people like myself, Asian Americans, and those who are allied with us, show that we aren't alone in this fight against racism and unjust acts against our community. Seeing people, being able to visualize it is very powerful and very important. And it was an amazing feeling. It's honestly, it felt religious even. It didn't feel in this world to see so many people around you who care about the same thing that you do. The number 2 reason I want to hold this rally was to promote solidarity and allyship between the Asian American community and other communities. So for our speaker lineup, we had half Asian Americans, but we also had half Black and brown and white folk. Because in this fight, we only make up about 5-6% of the population in the United States, and we are very small as it is. But even within our group, we are so diverse in so many ways. We are not a monolith, and we just need unity. Unity is something that is incredibly important between different groups. So forging bridges and making sure that we make friends and not enemies in this fight is so important. And the third goal that I had for this rally was to show our allies, show Boston the beauty of Chinatown and the contributions of Asian Americans around this area. So after the speaking segment of the rally, we had everyone march from the Parkton Bandstand in Boston Common, through Chinatown, through the Chinatown Gate, and to the State House, just as a way to show them this is who you're supporting. These are the elders and the businesses and the shops and the livelihoods that you are fighting for. And we, from the bottom of our hearts, we're incredibly grateful and appreciative. So thank you so much for showing up today for us. And while that rally was an incredible memory and something I will definitely live over and over, I continue to work in various ways in my personal strengths to continue this effort, because that alone is not enough and it will never be enough.
Great, thanks, Ryan. I'm going to try to do one more quick round of questions to all of you, and then we'll try to get to some of the live questions. So let me go back to DA Rollins. You've heard a number of ways in which people are responding. And I know that you're a very progressive, community-oriented DA. And so I want to get your thoughts about sort of what role law enforcement should play in this. And what are, if we could be candid, what are some of the tensions that exist and that we should name and address?
Absolutely. So I think law enforcement, we need to show up. You know, I loved what Savannah said, not just about the AAPI community and just how rich and vibrant and brilliant and diverse you all are, but we as BIPOC people generally, we need to go to the biggest harm when it's happening, right? And we need to stand as allies. And I like to say, you know, I don't need allies anymore. We need unindicted co-conspirators. We are in the fight of our lives. I don't want anyone getting indicted, but we need to go as close as we can to helping each other. And I think that starts with educating ourselves, right? If I get an A+ in women's issues and an A++ in Black or African-American or Caribbean issues, but I have an F- in LGBTQIA+, or even understanding the rich diversity of the AAPI community, we have to start educating ourselves, not just as leaders, but certainly as members of law enforcement, because we hold the keys to essentially all the reporting that needs to be happening. And I fully agree that we need mandated reporting structures, right? If people are self-reporting, we know that people don't have the time to do that. We're dealing, all of us, with vicarious trauma based on everything that we're seeing, whether that person could be my grandmother or not. What I saw in San Francisco, what I see in New York, with respect to, it is deeply impacting all of us. And then there's added trauma when it looks like somebody that could be in your family, but it's traumatic even if it isn't, because we're seeing this level of harm. So I think we need to educate ourselves. I think we need to be far more involved and public facing. And I think it should be easier than anything to file a complaint. I don't want you to have to get out of your house. I get it. We have, you know, my grandfather is 101 years old and from Barbados. He's not going online to fill out a form, but it should be really easy for us to get access to these things, or for law enforcement to come to us. Add to the fact that I think there's this misconception that immigration issues only impact the Latinx community. That is a huge lie. There are enormous swaths of the AAPI community that are terrified of ICE, right? And luckily, we are fortunate to live in Massachusetts, and myself and another DA sued ICE to say, stop, you know, terrorizing people in and around courthouses. And we hope to see continued change. But John, there's a lot of fear with even going to get help, because you don't want to disclose, even your own existence, right? And add to that the sort of generational differences that I think we all have as the child, you know, of my mom is first generation, my dad is second generation from Ireland and Barbados, that they don't want to create any problems. I mean, we are dealing with the sort of intergenerational tensions between your own family. So I think we have to make it easier. We have to make it fluent in everyone's language. We have to have it be as easy for the Ryans of the world to do it, which I'm sure Ryan can make an avatar that would fill out his form for him. And my 101-year-old grandfather, right, that wants to maybe have somebody come to the house who has an accent like him, or came to this country as well, or can speak to him in a way that he feels more comfortable and not ashamed. because there's a lot of shame that comes with this, because you also are saying, why did they choose me? What about me made this happen? And I'm sure the doctor can speak far more to that, but I hear from victims all the time. That's the biggest question they have is, why did they choose me of all these people?
Well, thank you. And I appreciate you lifting up the immigration issue as to why people might not report. Because even if we talk about immigration, among the 11 million or so undocumented immigrants in the United States, about 1.7 million are Asians. So recognizing that piece, and I appreciate what your office is doing in making sure that people feel safe in reporting. One piece that, Savannah, you talked about that actually one of the people in the audience is asking a question, but I want to address, because you talked about the experiences with living alongside African-American and Latinx communities and how the communities interacted with each other. One person asked, this is Dr. Lloyd Sheldon Johnson from, I believe, Cambridge, Massachusetts. He talks about the reluctance to discuss the chasm and fracture that exists at times between the Black and Brown communities and the AAPI communities. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, well, thank you, Doctor, for asking that wonderful question, because we need to talk about it, right? And so not everything is sugar and cookies, you know? And so what I'm trying to say is that this country, since its birth, had always done everything in its power to continue to divide and conquer. And how do you do that, right? How do you continue to divide and conquer? You put people against each other. You whether you use the media, whether you use government systems, whether you train people to become elected officials, there are certain things in place, systemic and structural racism, that continues to divide and conquer people of color. And an example of that is the minority myth with Asian Americans. Why would you create a myth to say that one specific group is better than the other, unless you don't want them to get along? Why Asian Americans, right? Why say Asian Americans are the perfect group that gets good grades, that gets becomes engineers and doctors, that gives back to this country? You do that so that you are looked at and hated upon sometimes by the Black and Brown communities. It's intentional. These things are happening, and it's intentional to make sure that we don't unite and we don't become a one voice, right? And another thing I want to share too is that a lot of this stems from fear. Okay, a lot of people are scared of the unknown, and I think District Attorney Rollins brought up a good point about education, right? Once you educate yourself about different groups and ethnicities and backgrounds and history, you get a better understanding about what the other group is. But if you don't understand the other group as well as you should, and you only hear and see what's on the media, especially from the media, that is sometimes a part of structural racism, and you're only gonna react to what you see. And so when you are a person that's watching the news and you see the news broadcasting a Black person beating up an Asian person or a brown person beating up an Asian person, you know, a lot of that could be intentional, right? A lot of that could be intentional. But what I want to challenge the audience is that you have to look at that and know that things are in place to divide and conquer us. You have to look at that half glass full and say you can't let a handful of people that are fearful of something that they don't know to represent a whole group of people. And so I want to encourage you that fear creates hate, and that hate is the opposite of love. And we need to spread love as much as possible to each other, because at the end of the day, love trumps hate.
Thank you so much, Savannah. And to put a finer point on that, and this is something I want to make sure people hear, because there is some misinformation out there that African Americans are disproportionately attacking Asian Americans. And you see sometimes these viral videos, and that tries to quote unquote prove that point. The studies that are out there, now I will admit there aren't that many, but the studies that are out there disprove that. There's an NIH study that came out in January that said that 76% of the attackers are Caucasians. There's another study from a University of Michigan professor that she's going to formalize in a report in the next couple of weeks that says that only 5% of the attackers of Asian Americans are African American. About 90% are Caucasian. And then to put an even finer point, if, as DA Rollins was talking about, the murders of the 6 Asian American women in Atlanta or the 4 Sikh Americans in Indianapolis, those were white males that did that. And so we need to put that in that context. So I very much appreciate, Savannah, what you're talking about. To move also to talk about sort of what our response looks like. And I know, Dr. Vuki, you talked a little bit about, so what are the resources that we have available to really address some of the stresses, address some of the psychological trauma. I'd like to have you talk a little bit about those resources. And in particular, I believe you've done work, especially with children. There's one of our questioners, Helen Lee, asked about sort of how do we help the youth of our future generations to avoid becoming these victims, especially in school systems.
Great question. Yeah, so the work that I've done really is to create a parent guide that came out this past year. And it came out of that, why it came out was when I told you that 8-year-old boy that came to my clinic and said he was teased and no one helped him. And he started to self-harm. He had tears in his eyes. And when I turned to the mother had also tears in her eyes. And she said to me, she goes, what am I supposed to say? What am I supposed to do? Isn't it true? The virus did come out of China. And so I kept hearing stories and stories from parents, like they didn't know how to respond to their child. And so that really started this idea of, we really need to start educating or helping our parents have those conversations, start at the very beginning in the household. And we know that Asian American families, Asian American parents, they're the least likely to have discussions about race amongst all ethnic groups. And so we started a guide, and it really has a lot of information in there, tips for parents on how to talk to their kids, how to have conversations. And this was very much a community effort. Every step that we took, we actually solicited feedback from a parents group. They were astounded that there was racial discrimination in the country. They didn't know the history. So if they don't know the history, then when the children come home and tell them about what's happening in school, they can't speak to it. So then when I asked the adolescents, do you want your parents to ask you about race and discrimination? And they said, yes, if they ask me this question, I will talk to them. So it's really about empowering parents to say that silence is not an option, because a lot of times parents are afraid that they will re-traumatize their children, that they will bring up unpleasant emotions, and that they don't want to harm the child. And so parents need to know that conversations are essential in the home. They build resilience, they build pride, and a sense of unity within the family. And so this guide that I know that has been posted, what's great about it, it's been translated into 4 different Asian languages. So if you are curious and would like to know tips on how to talk to your children, it's written it's in English, Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. And I want to let parents know this is a guide for adolescents and teens. And I've been, a lot of other parents say, can you do a guide for younger kids? So we are going to develop one for 3 to 6-year-olds and then 7 to 10. So that is to come out. The other thing I wanted to about resources, I think is, in addition to having this conversation, is for parents or anyone to start books, to read books for the children, talking about celebrating different cultures, right? Celebrating that they look different, but it's beautiful, and it's not something to be fearful of. And so we encourage that there are many books out there that are different, actually written in different languages, that we would like their parents and the schools actually to start reading to children.
Great, thank you. Turning to you, Ryan, one of the things I wanted to talk about is whether you see a generational divide in some of the activism that we're seeing with respect to the anti-Asian American environment that we see. And maybe to put a finer point on that, if I might, is one of the things that Savannah talked about is how we have to work in coalitions, interracial, and recognizing that within our own Asian American community, we've had anti-Blackness that we have to confront, and how we have those conversations, especially if we're going to be candid, oftentimes it's with our elders. So can you speak to those experiences and how you and your friends have been navigating that?
Sure. So I definitely think there is a generational gap when it comes to fighting anti-Asian hate. At least from my personal experience, I've noticed that older people tend to work through established organizations and have much more experience in their respective fields, whereas younger people have passion, energy, and care, but only if both groups work together can we elicit effective and all-encompassing change. Young people need to turn to older people who've been doing the work before them to guide their actions, and older people can utilize the drive and manpower of younger people to mobilize initiatives. And as you were saying before regarding addressing anti-Blackness in the Asian American community, when it comes to working together, we also cannot come together and not talk about the pressing issues and the deep linings that we have in our own community. So we need to have difficult conversations between both the young and old about anti-Blackness in our culture and things that we can change. For example, one thing would be silence and being a bystander. Often in the Asian American community, we're raised to believe that silence is safe. If you don't say anything and you witness it, it's okay because you're not a part of it. But then we can't be hypocritical in that sense when it starts happening to us and we don't see other people speaking out and reaching out and helping us. So we need to be part of the initiative, part of the people who speak up, because it's happening to us. We're a group that's marginalized and oppressed. And when we see other groups that are marginalized and oppressed, we need to speak up for them in order to have them speak up for us. So it's a unified effort, and we can't be fragmented. We need to stand side by side, hand in hand with others, and make sure that we're having the conversations that we need to move forward.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. As you may have heard, I've been trying to incorporate some of your questions into the questions that I ask. Even if I haven't mentioned your name, hopefully you saw an element of your question in some of these questions. What I'd like to do in the last couple of minutes is just do what I would call a lightning round for everyone. And I would ask you to try to keep it to about 2 sentences. And the question is this, what is the one thing that you would ask audience members to take away from this panel? Is there one action you would ask them to take? And let me start with DA Rollins, if I could.
AAPI hate is not a BIPOC issue exclusively. We need everyone involved in this to echo what Ryan said. We can no longer have gender violence be a woman's issue. You know, the issues in the Black community be a Black. We all need to be involved in this 100%, and we have to start showing up for each other and being as passionate about the things that don't directly impact us as the things that do.
Thank you. Ryan.
I want everyone to come out of this knowing that awareness is not enough without action. So while our rally did generate a lot of awareness, we attempted to make it a sustained effort. We raised over $10,000 to donate to local community organizations and also to invest in safety kits for local elders here in Boston. And we also encourage people at the end of the rally to go out and support Chinatown, whether it be getting takeout or ordering dinner. So brainstorm creative ways to speak up, because apathy is the most dangerous thing in these times. Be strong, be safe, but don't be silent, and use your strength. It doesn't have to be through the form of a rally. You can do it through art, you can write journals, you can publish a book, but speak up in some way and speak up in the way that best works for you.
Right. Dr. Vuki.
So Ryan just took my thunder. So my takeaway everywhere I go is silence is not an option. It is our collective responsibility to speak up, to support one another, but absolutely silence is not an option.
Thank you. And Savannah, bring us home.
Hey, you know, we live in a world full of hatred and uneasiness. And if you live a life spirit full of love and you want to keep continuing to spread that love, and then when you move with love, then you don't have any fear of learning about something new. You don't have any fear about hugging each other once COVID is over. You don't have any fear about giving high fives. You live the life of love. You're going to learn a lot about other people. And when you learn a lot about other people, the love is only going to get stronger. So spread that love, everybody, no matter where you are in life. Spread it, spread it, spread it. Love.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Last thing I would offer to everyone is this is the start of a conversation. What we have tried to provide to you is the start of a conversation. We would ask all of you to use whatever platforms you have, whatever groups you belong to, and continue this conversation. Thank you all very much for joining us. Take care.
Thanks everyone for your wonderful and great and insightful questions tonight. It's now my pleasure to introduce Leverett Wang, a member of the GBH Advisors Council and one of the organizers for tonight's event. Leverett?
Hi, everyone. As Liz mentioned, my name's Leverett Wang, and I'm a longtime loyal GBH donor, and I serve on GBH's Advisors Council. Now, for those of you who joined us for last year's Heritage Month celebration and for previous year's events, you'll note that for some reason, the folks at GBH like to have me join you after the event to ask you to support GBH and its mission. And like me, you're probably wondering why. Maybe it's because I love talking about how my family and I were all raised on GBH programming, starting with Sesame Street, then Curious George, and then Mr. Rogers, who I clearly patterned my wardrobe after, and then Word Girl and Wildcrats. And now that our son is older, shows like Nova and American Experience. Or maybe it's because I get excited that GBH offers diverse, educational, thought-provoking programming you can't find anywhere else, not just during AAPI Heritage Month, but year-round. And this evening's a perfect example. We've discovered some fascinating films coming from GBH World, heard from the amazing writer Amy Tan, and engaged with our insightful panel on how we can all be allies to fight the attacks on our AAPI community. Whether it's local news on 89.7 and GBH2, or its national programs, Frontline, Nova, Masterpiece, American Experience, America Reframed, Local USA, Stories from the Stage, and so many more. GBH does an incredible job in amplifying diverse voices, as with those heard tonight. GBH focuses on differences that make a difference and feels strongly about producing here to share with the world. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm here to ask all of you, please consider being a loyal ally of GBH for its work in communities here, in New England, and across the country. If you live in this area, you can volunteer or donate your time to support our programming and events that help us learn, appreciate, and celebrate differences. And for those of you turning in from other places, please reach out to your local PBS station to get involved. Please consider joining our family and supporting us at any level you can. It's so easy to do. Just click on the link in the chat tab and give whatever you can. They've made it so simple that even I can do it. And this is especially exciting. Tonight, when you contribute $75, you'll receive Amy Tan's memoir, Where the Past Begins, which reveals ways our memories and experiences can inform our creative work. And you can learn more about Amy's processes and her suggestions for other writers. As a reminder, we'll share all of tonight's resources with you in our next email. So thank you so much for joining us here tonight, and we hope to see you again soon, and hopefully next year. Now, back to Liz Chang.
Thank you very much, Leverett, for all that you do for GBH. And thank you, Amy Tan and Dr. Pam Ettinger, for the great conversation that kicked off this event. And thanks again to Rachel, to Catherine, Silvana, and Ryan for appearing on our panel. And our deep gratitude to John C. Yang for moderating this important conversation. Thanks also to our board member planning committee for helping us curate tonight's content and for connecting us with so many community partners. We could not do this event without you. Thanks to everyone at American Masters, KJPR Films, and WNET for bringing us Amy Tan's unique and inspiring story, which can be streamed on your PBS video app. Thanks to our local community partners, Porter Square Books, National Association of Asian American Professionals, Boston, Boston Asian American Film Festival, the Partnership, and the Asian American Resource Workshop, and so many others for their support of GBH. Many thanks to the GBH event staff, Liz Haggard, and GBHers Amy Axelrod and Sarah Wharton. As always, you can stay informed about our virtual events by visiting our events page, gbh.org/events. Thank you for your time, and good night.